Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 1 to 13. This is session 7, and the title is Every Life Valued. Our text is Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 to 4, and verses 14 to 17, and chapter 9, verses 1 to 8. The lesson summary statement is Jesus values every person. I've written on the board the word homeless, and then I'm using the suggestion in the Explore the Bible about a police officer retired and then provided washing the clothes for homeless people. And then that will spin off into the lesson. Jesus has set the greatest example of evaluating all human beings. Jesus is the long expected Messiah, and Matthew is about the task of proving that. And so what I want to do as I go set the context for this lesson is I want to pull together the book of Matthew. I want them to see the flow of the story and to have it in mind. And so I'm just going to have them take their Bibles and starting in chapter 1, Matthew's proof that Jesus is the expected Messiah is found in the genealogy. He fits the predictions, no one else does. And then there's also the birth narratives that fulfill the prophecy of the coming Messiah. That's chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 and 4, I'll point out that the public ministry of Jesus is endorsed by John the Baptist. And then there is his victory over Satan in the wilderness. And the chapter concludes with Jesus calling his disciples to follow him. This is their responsibility. They are to obey him. They are to be with him. They are to help him make disciples for Christ. Now, once the calling of the disciples happens, then Jesus goes into the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. And this is laying out the requirements, the lifestyle of a follower of Jesus Christ. In essence, in chapter 5, he talks about the fact that his disciples are going to think differently. He says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And so Jesus' disciples think differently. They see more deeply into the scriptures than previous understandings. And then chapter 6 is basically, the point is about God. The point is about God when it comes to piety in the first 18 verses. And the point is about God when it comes to possessions in the last part of chapter 6. And then relationships in the first part of chapter 7. But the message concludes with the people being forced to make a choice. There's only two ways. There are true prophets and false prophets. And there are two ways to build your life, on the foundation or not on the foundation. You must choose. Do you want to be a disciple? And it says the people were amazed at the authority of Jesus. And so chapters 8 and 9, where we've come to for our lesson today, picks up on this idea of authority. And you see this interplay between the authority of Jesus' words, which we saw in chapters 5 through 7, and the authority of Jesus' works that is played between these demonstrations of miracles. Now, the way chapter 8 and 9 is laid out is this alternating of miracles and descriptions of the disciples. I'll just give this to you. It starts with 3 miracles, chapter 8, verses 1 to 17. And we're going to look at one of those, or 2 of those. And then the 3 miracles are followed by 2 descriptions of disciples. Jesus tells a man that he doesn't have a place to lay his head. That's the kind of commitment that it's going to take. And then he tells another man that the commitment to follow Jesus is even greater than the commitment to the family. And so this is a description of the disciples. That's followed by 3 more miracles, chapter 8, verse 23 to chapter 9, verse 8. And then that is followed again by 2 descriptions of a disciple. That's chapter 9, verse 9 through verse 17. And then we come back to 3 miracles again. Chapter 9, verse 18 to verse 34. Some disagreement about whether there are 9 miracles or 10 miracles. One miracle is an interruption as Jesus is going to raise a little girl back to life. Some have said that this is a picture of Moses One of the ways that Moses established his authority with God's people and certainly with Pharaoh were through the 10 plagues. And some see in this outline that this is what's happening again. The teachings and the miracles are establishing Jesus's authority. But the point of this is Jesus possesses absolute authority in this world. You see that through the demonstrations of his miracles. And then through the statement of discipleship, this requires an allegiance from the disciples over the world. Now, the key concerns of chapter 8 and chapter 9 is to help us understand who Jesus is. It's an emphasis on Christology. But that leads to a discussion about discipleship, and that is, once you've established the authority of Jesus, then that tells us how we're to respond as disciples of Jesus. So that's the interplay. Now, our Sunday school material is taking this lesson and using it for the Sanctity of Life Sunday. We're seeing in this lesson, in these miracles, how Jesus treats people, how Jesus values people. And our lesson is Jesus values every person. And when you think about that statement, that really is quite a challenging statement, that Jesus values every person, and he's calling his disciples to do the same thing. That's a bit of an expansive introduction, but I wanted to tie in where we've come to in terms of our study of Matthew's gospel. Now, the first point is leprosy. Before we read the text, I want to know from you, from the class, how lepers were treated in that day. And many in your class will understand and have a knowledge of that. And then you can add other things to it that you've discovered from your studies about how lepers were treated. And that sets you up to understand what's happening in this text. These people were hopeless. They were in a terrifying condition. And it is a picture of sin and our separation from God. And then I want to read through the text and make some comments about it. Verse 1, when he came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. That ties us to chapter 7. The word followed here is the main verb, and what follows is a description and the instruction on discipleship. We've been told who Jesus is. Now we're going to be told how we're to respond to him. Right away, a man with leprosy came up and knelt before him. The statement right away has about a sudden appearance. Now, you know from the previous discussion that lepers had to announce themselves. They had to stay a minimum of 6 feet away. If the wind was blowing, they had to stay anywhere from 100 to 150 feet away. They had to cover their face with a cloth. They had to wear distinctive clothing that made it aware that they were lepers. They couldn't comb their hair. They weren't allowed into walled cities or towns. Some rabbis bragged about how they had thrown rocks at lepers to keep them away. If a rabbi saw a leper on a street, many of them would hide someplace until the leper was removed. So you can imagine the kind of stigma that's attached to these people, the kind of fear that has to them. And then all of a sudden, here's Jesus, and in the midst of them is this leper. And you can imagine the emotions and how it was heightened. It says, right away, a man with leprosy came up and knelt before him. Now, the word knelt is a word that is used in Matthew's gospel, oftentimes to describe an attitude of worship. And this word is reserved in the New Testament for reverence to God. And so in one sense, the man was worshiping Jesus, but the man didn't fully know who Jesus was. As a couple of commentators have said, Matthew is telling us that his actions are greater than what he actually understands. But he comes to Jesus with humility and with respect and reverence. And he says, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Now, isn't that amazing? He doesn't question the power of Jesus to make him healed. Now, the rabbis had said that leprosy was on the same level as death in terms of being healed and brought back to life. And this man is saying, I know you can do this. Now, he probably had heard of two other occasions where Jesus had done this. And then here's the second shock. The first shock is the man suddenly is in appearance and he's right there in front of Jesus. And here's the second shock. Reaching out his hand, Jesus touched him, saying, I am willing, be made clean. Have you watched a child went to reach for a glass and you knew just as soon as she was reaching for it, she's going to knock it over and spill the contents, but you can't react fast enough to catch her little hand or to catch the glass and keep it from happening. That's what I imagine when I see this scene and Jesus reaches out his hand. I can see the disciples gasp and want to try to reach for Jesus's hand, but before they can even move, he's done it. Jesus has touched him. And you know from your previous discussion that touching a leper also made you unclean. But Jesus is so powerful, his authority is so great that he reverses that process. His touch makes the unclean clean. Immediately, his leprosy was cleansed. Then Jesus told him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. The gift was two birds over running water. One bird would be killed. Then the blood of that bird would be placed on the second bird, and then the second bird would be released. It was a picture of death and resurrection. And so Jesus said to this man, I want you to go and perform this ritual. I want the priest to examine you, which oftentimes took a quarantine, and then they would perform this ritual. But what happened, if this man would do that, what happened is not only would there be the testimony that a man who had a death sentence on him had life now, but it was also his way to be introduced back into the community. He could go back to his family. He could go back to his village. And obviously, when he showed up, there would be this gasp, this wonder, this amazement, and it would be a way in which he could give even more testimony and glory to the Lord Jesus. So that's what's happening here. Now, I've created a list of folks who may feel overlooked or excluded. And I've not included the homeless in that list. I think they're a pretty obvious one, and we've talked about that at the beginning. I'd like to know from my class if you know of people who are in these categories. And do you know if anyone is involved with them? So I have this list that I've made up of these categories. And I'm just going to ask the class these things. Individuals living with physical or cognitive disabilities who may face barriers to participate in the community. Anybody know someone like that? Do you know anyone who's maybe in our class that's working with someone like that? Widows, widowers, those who live alone and may experience isolation or loneliness. A third category, immigrants, or those for whom English is not their first language, or who may struggle to connect due to cultural or language differences. How about this? Youth or teenagers who feel misunderstood or dismissed by older generations. People struggling with mental health challenges who may feel stigmatized or unsupported. Those who are new to the area or congregation and haven't yet found a sense of belonging. Older adults in nursing care facilities separated from former social networks. Members of minority groups who may have different backgrounds or beliefs than the majority of their community. And The point that I'm trying to make is not are you committed to an extended ministry to an overlooked community, but instead, do you know anyone that fits those categories that you could just provide a touch to them this week or in the days to come, and it would be a way of expressing Jesus's care for them? So I want to talk with the class about that, get some feedback on some of those categories, and maybe even add to the category of people like that. Now, the second point is fever and demon possession. Another of Matthew's fulfillment passages is this passage in verse 17, and it's to show that his healing authority is messianic in nature. He heals, and the point the lesson's wanting to make in terms of being sanctity of life is that he heals a person in a lowly category. Now, the leper obviously is the bottom of the rung, but someone else is a Gentile. That's the miracle in between the leper and Peter's mother. And then, of course, a woman. She's not considered very important and influential in the society. And so what you see is Jesus ministering, showing care, showing value to a leper, a Gentile, and a woman. Again, I want to read through the text, just give some explanation. What I'm trying to do here is maybe help bring the story alive. Jesus went into Peter's house and saw his mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. Now, you know that if you have to go to your bed, that you're a pretty sick person. And so she obviously is a very sick person. And it says she's with a fever, and the tense conveys a prolonged illness. Fever was a serious business in that day. Malaria was common in that area, and people could die of fever. And so this is very serious. And Jesus went into Peter's house, saw his mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. Now Matthew leaves out some of the details. He really pares the story down when you look at in comparison to Mark and Luke. And what you have in Matthew is a focusing of this story. So verse 15, so he touched her hand and the fever left her. The idea of touch is he placed his hand on it, but he took her by the hand. Now, the reason that's important is Mark tells us that he took her by the hand and he lifted her up. He didn't wait. And that by the time she hit her feet, she was completely, fully recovered. It was absolutely gone. There was no lingering weakness associated with this fever, because then she got up and began to serve him. And the idea is full service. She's completely healthy. She has strength and energy, and she's full of life. And so she begins to serve Jesus. Verse 16, when evening came, they brought to him lots, or many, who were demon possessed. And we know from the other parallel passages in Mark and Luke that they waited till the evening, because this was the Sabbath. And then in the evening, when the Sabbath was over, then people began to come. And notice how sick they were. They brought them. It wasn't sick people who came to Jesus on their own. These people were brought. Maybe some of them didn't come willingly, like the demon possessed, but it may also be conveying that these people that came, every one of them was a serious case, that someone had to help them to get to Jesus. And there were many of them. And he healed or cast the demons out of those who were demon possessed. He drove out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. Just a word. Think how simple that was. Think how effortless that was. It's showing the authority and the power that Jesus has over not only disease, but over the demonic world. And notice, there's no one who showed up, no matter what their disease was, whatever their demon possession was. There was no one who went away and Jesus couldn't help him. That is amazing. There's no medical professional that can make that claim that he healed all of them. But Jesus is the authority over disease and demonic powers. Verse 17, so that what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled, he himself took our weaknesses and carried out our diseases. Now the context of that is Isaiah 53. It is the suffering servant passages. It's about Jesus's vicarious death for our salvation. And yet he uses that to say that sin and sickness is an element of sin. The reason there's sickness in the world is because of sin. But the day's coming when Jesus not only will save us of our sin, a day's coming when he's going to save us of our sickness as well. And God bless the day that happens. Now, the application point for this says we should value people of all stages in life. Society would not have wanted to waste its resources on this woman. But Jesus saw her as valuable. It has been said that we live in a culture of death and that it's spreading across our nation. Suicide is epidemic with veterans, youth, and senior adults. The abortion pill is still killing many, many babies in our nation, and euthanasia is legal in 12 states in our nation. This is no surprise as Christianity loses influence in the culture in our nation. People ask, why is it humane to put down Fido when he's suffering and not going to recover, but it's criminal to do this for Grandpa? And so I want to ask the class that question. What's the difference? Why is one seen as acceptable and even compassionate, and the other is not? And then after discussion, there's a YouTube. It's called Lisa's Euthanasia Speech. Lisa's Euthanasia Speech. It's 4 minutes and 41 seconds, and it's a child. And she gives this wonderful speech about the dangers and the reasons why we should oppose euthanasia. And I want to conclude this point with this video from YouTube, Lisa's Euthanasia Speech. Now, the last point is Jesus values every person, and the last point is paralysis, chapter 9, verses 1 to 8. Now, only God has the authority to forgive sins. Jesus proved his divine authority to forgive sins by healing this paralytic. And since he values everyone, we must value everyone because he is our authority. Again, I want to go through the text and give some explanation. The text can be broken down into 3 parts. The first part, verses 1 and 2, is the forgiveness. And then verses 3 to 5, that's this discussion about blasphemy. And then verse 6 and 7, the man's healed and he goes home. So first of all, this issue of forgiveness. Verse 1, so he got into a boat, crossed over, and came to his own town. Now that's connected with the story that is in chapter 8, that concludes chapter 8. Verse 2, then just then some men brought him a paralytic lying on a stretcher. Now think about this. They brought him a paralytic lying on a stretcher. This man is in such a condition that he cannot help. It required 4 men to carry him. This man has no abilities to help himself at all. Seeing their faith, we don't know if Jesus is talking about the 4 men who brought him, or if we're talking about all 5 of them, or if you're talking about the paralytic. But seeing their faith, Jesus told the paralytic, have courage, son, your sins are forgiven. Now that's not why they brought him. I'm sure they brought him for the healing. But Jesus saw the greatest need of this man, and that is to be forgiven of his sin. So he gets a new body, But if he's not been forgiven and restored to God, that's not going to be any benefit to him ultimately. Verse 3, at this, some of the scribes said to themselves, he's blaspheming. Perceiving their thoughts, Jesus said, why are you thinking evil things in your heart? For which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, and it's written in tense means ongoing, or to say, get up and walk. And again, it's the same tense, or keep on walking. But so you know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Then he told the paralytic, get up, take your stretcher, and go home. So he got up and went home. When the crowds saw this, they were amazed. Just a few things. Blasphemy is a Greek word that we've made into an English word. And it basically means to speak harm. It depicts an attitude of a person who displays by his speaking or his actions that he's against God and he's opposing the character of God. In the Old Testament, people usually committed blasphemy by an improper use of God's name or by speaking of God in a disrespectful manner. Pretending to do or be anything that only God can do or be was thought to be blasphemy. So the scribes believe that Jesus has taken on God's authority to forgive sins, and he doesn't have that right to do that. And so they call it blasphemy. Now, it says he perceives their thoughts. This is one of those passages where it gives us an understanding of the omniscience of Jesus. That, you could say maybe he was reading their expressions or body language. That's not what's said. He understood what they were thinking. And let me just give you some passages where the omniscience of Jesus is seen in Matthew. Chapter 12, verse 25. Chapter 22, verse 18. Luke chapter 16, verse 8. And Luke chapter 11, verse 17. John chapter 2, verse 25. And John chapter 6, verse 61 and 64. There was a sense in which Jesus knew the hearts of men. He understood and read their hearts. It says that their hearts were thinking evil things. They were opposing the will of God that was at work. Now, when he says to this man, get up, take your stretcher, and go home. In verse 7, so he got up and went home. Think about what that must have been like. I don't know how long, we don't know how long the man was paralyzed, but imagine he's carried by 4 to get to this meeting with Jesus. And now with his mat under his arm, he is walking back. I imagine he is skipping back. I can imagine he's stepping back with energy. Imagine what it was like when he got back home. Imagine what it was like for his friends who carried him. Can you imagine? What do you suppose the scribes were thinking when they saw this? It was stunning, a stunning story. Now, to close this point, I'm going to ask a member of the class who has lived with a physical handicap to talk to the class about their experiences. How have people shown value and love to them? Because they have an experience of life that I don't personally have. And I'm wanting to drive home this idea that Jesus values every person. And most likely, what this person has experienced, they would not have experienced in other cultures that didn't have a Christian influence. Some reason, God has us study a lesson that says, show love and value to others in the name of Jesus. So what does that mean for you? Is there some one-time action that you need to take in order to have an impact on someone for the love of Jesus? Or Or has God been calling some of you into some kind of ongoing ministry that we've touched on, or we haven't touched on, but he's been speaking to you about? But Jesus values everyone, and he calls us to show that love to others. God bless you.